Is it possible for a Christian to avoid the cross? If so, why would Jesus tell me to carry my cross daily? If Jesus suffered so that I don't have to, why am I told to share in his sufferings? And if Jesus died instead of us, why would Paul boast about being crucified with Christ?
I'm reviewing the book by Andrew Remington Rillera, Lamb of the Free, Recovering the Varied Sacrificial Understandings of Jesus' Death. This was one of the most anticipated and one of the most talked about books of last year, in my circles at least, and for good reason. I've read this book twice now, and both times involved lots of pausing to take notes, because this book forced my brain to stretch and contort into some uncomfortable places, but an uncomfortable that was ultimately rewarding and satisfying. Okay, this is an important book, but I wasn't going to review it. I was worried it might be too controversial. I'm still nervous, but I think this book and this topic is too important to avoid. And although there were times when I felt Rillera overstated his case, or when it didn't quite land for me, overall this is going to be a positive review. So what I'll do by way of review, I'll try and present an overview of the book, I'll share some of my notes, and I'll share some of Rillera's more compelling quotes. Basically, this book is an attempt to untangle the various knotted and interrelated misunderstandings about sacrifice in the Old Testament, so that we can more clearly see how the New Testament authors reflect on the meaning of Jesus' death when they make use of sacrificial imagery. And Rillera doesn't beat about the bush. Straight up, he makes an outrageous claim. The logic is not Jesus died so that we don't have to. Rather, it is Jesus died so that we, together, can follow in his steps and die with him and like him, having full fellowship with his sufferings so that we might share in the likeness of his resurrection. It would be illogical to say Jesus was resurrected so that we won't be. And it would be equally illogical to suggest that Jesus died so that we don't have to. Yes, Jesus died for us, and yet Rillera says this does not mean Jesus died instead of us. It means that he died ahead of us, and he expects us to participate with him in his death. Jesus dying ahead of us, not instead of us, becomes somewhat of a catchphrase that is repeated throughout the book. And frankly, by the end of the book, he's argued his case so well, I'd be surprised if, well, since its release in March 2024, I've yet to see anyone respond with any kind of compelling rebuttal. Take that as a challenge. A lot of the groundwork is done in the best book in the Bible, and it's here, in Leviticus, that Rillera challenges the idea that an animal's death substituted for the offender's death. And one often overlooked reason, as Rillera rightly points out, is that there's actually no sacrifice available whenever a crime calls for capital punishment, or when the offender is to be cut off. Rillera then makes the helpful but surprising observation that it was only the non-atoning sacrifices that were eaten by the people. Building on this, he shows in great detail how ritual impurity was contagious, but it could be removed by simply taking a bath or by an atoning sacrifice. Moral impurity, on the other hand, was more serious, and while it was not contagious, moral impurity could not be removed by atoning sacrifices. And so, Rillera points out, atoning sacrifices like the sin offering were impotent to deal with the moral impurity caused by intentional or high-handed sins. This is a problem the prophets are aware of. The sins which caused Israel to go into exile were the very kinds of sins for which there was no sacrifice available. Israel's hope, therefore, for release from exile is not one that relies primarily on a sacrifice. And so later, when we see Jesus eating with sinners and forgiving morally impure people, he is forgiving and cleansing people in a way that was outside or beyond the limits of what the Levitical sacrificial system was ever capable of doing. Still in Leviticus, I found myself nodding along in agreement as Rillera showed that while death was a major cause of impurity, somehow a sacrificial animal did not defile the altar. He says, therefore, it is not even proper to call sacrifice a ritual death, because the ritual depends on it not actually being comprehended as a death, which would bring impurity into the dwelling place. Sacrifice is rather a way to access life and avoid all associations with death. And one reason, although Rillera provides many, is that according to Leviticus 17, the blood of a sacrificial animal represents its life. Discussing how blood applications sanctified the altar, Rillera suggests that on the rare occasions when blood is applied to humans, they, like a sacrificial animal, are transitioning from one metaphysical realm into another. They are moving from common and becoming holy. And when the blood of the covenant is sprinkled on the people, it signifies Israel as a nation becoming holy. Similarly, when blood is applied to someone recovering from a skin disease, since the skin disease was associated with death, they are symbolically transitioning from death to life. And priests? Well, just like the holy objects were sanctified with blood, after blood is applied to Aaron and his sons, they essentially become holy furniture, walking sacred dwelling place furniture. The second half of the book is all about Jesus, and Rillera shows that while old covenant sacrifices may have been impotent to cleanse moral impurity, Jesus is able to overcome the forces of ritual and moral impurity. Basically, anything Leviticus can do, Jesus can do better. However, the way Jesus cleans up impurity requires a closer look, because Jesus forgives sins and cleanses moral and ritual impurity while he's alive? I'll let Rillera explain. This moral purification is not due to Jesus' death per se, though this is part of it, but more because of who he is as the source of contagious holy purification. Jesus' death and resurrection is still part of this whole framework because it proves he can not only purify skin disease, for instance, but also his life is the kind of life that cannot be held down by death. His life nullifies death itself. The point is, just as it is the nature of Jesus' very being that purifies ritual impurities that contact Jesus, it is Jesus' very being that makes him powerful enough to remove moral impurities. Having thoroughly surveyed sacrifice and atonement in the Old Testament, Rillera draws attention to something that many New Testament scholars miss. The use of explicit sacrificial and atonement language is only rarely applied to Jesus. You might imagine that Jesus' death is all about atonement, but the actual word atonement is only applied to Jesus in 2 New Testament books, Hebrews and 1 John. And the verb form of atonement, the word used all throughout the Old Testament, doesn't show up at all in the New Testament. Something else that might come as a shock? Jesus' death is not always a sacrifice. Rillera pays close attention to when the New Testament authors conceptualize Jesus' death as a sacrifice and when they do not. Rillera's reading of the New Testament reveals that Jesus' death is not automatically always in the category of sacrifice. Similarly, you might assume the language of blood being poured out is automatically sacrificial language, but again, no. Rillera sets the record straight. Half of the times blood is poured out in the New Testament, it's describing murder. There's a confusing story in the Bible where the prophet Ezekiel lays on his side for a number of days and bears the iniquity of Israel and Judah. Ezekiel is representing them. He is demonstrating what's coming for Israel and Judah. Yet, as he lies there, he is sharing in and identifying with God's people and the covenant curses they are about to endure. According to Rillera, one facet of Jesus' death and resurrection is like the prophet's actions. As priest and Israelite, Ezekiel and Jesus both are place sharing, enacting Israel's curse and her eventual restoration. Jesus was born at a time when Israel was experiencing covenant curse. Jesus lived his life under Roman occupation as an Israelite, experiencing Israel's covenant curses and judgment. And Rillera applies Jesus' place sharing to the temple as well. When Jesus says, "Destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days," Jesus takes the judgment that he announces for the temple upon himself as one so united with Israel that their destiny becomes his and vice versa. Jesus' resurrection, therefore, signals Israel's resurrection and thus their restoration. And what Jesus did, he didn't do instead of Israel, he did it as Israel. And so, as much as we participate in Jesus' death and resurrection, we participate in the destruction of the old and restoration to the new. For if we have been united with him in a death like his, we will certainly also be united with him in a resurrection like his. That's not Rillera, that's Paul. Is Jesus' death a sacrifice? Yeah, it is. However, Passover is the only context in which Jesus himself explicitly links his own death to a sacrifice. Unsurprisingly, it's also the most widespread interpretation of Jesus' death as a sacrifice by the New Testament writers. And so, Rillera spends a lot of time exploring Jesus' sacrificial death through the lens of Passover and how that connects to covenant and even to the peace offering. Have you ever noticed that the author of Hebrews never mentions the Lord's Supper? Neither had I. But Rillera suggests that this is because the author of Hebrews is concerned with associating Jesus with atonement. But since sacrifices that provided atonement were not eaten, it becomes increasingly apparent that Hebrews is concerned with a different aspect of Jesus' sacrifice, namely that he, as high priest, makes atonement in the heavenly dwelling place. Rillera draws a lot from David Moffat's book on Hebrews called Rethinking the Atonement. Should I do a review of that book too? Let me know in the comments. Just as the Day of Atonement does not focus on the slaughter of the animal, but the presentation of its blood, that is, its life, before God, so the author of Hebrews thinks in terms of the presentation of Jesus' indestructible life before God as the central act that affects atonement. Again, citing Moffat, the moment of atonement was not on the cross, but rather in the heavenly sanctuary where Jesus, as high priest, presents his indestructible life and lifeblood. Guess what? Hebrews 2 adds support to Rillera's thesis that while Christ suffered for us, he didn't suffer instead of us. When Hebrews says we are to participate with Christ in his sufferings, bearing his reproach, we are so intimately connected with Jesus that our sufferings are his sufferings and vice versa. And when Hebrews 6 says that Jesus is our forerunner, this adds even more weight to Rillera's thesis that what Christ does is ahead of us, not instead of us. Peter picks up on this theme too. Quoting Isaiah, Peter identifies the suffering servant as Jesus, the one who suffered for us as an example so that we should follow in his steps. Why are you yelling at me? Don't worry, if you're like me, you've probably thought of that verse and you're yelling, what about Jesus set forth as a propitiation? What about he who knew no sin was made sin? Jesus gave his life as a ransom? He became a curse for us? Fear not, Rillera anticipated your yelling, and he finishes the book by addressing several of those verses that probably popped up. I'll finish with a quote. Jesus is a contagious source of holiness that purges all manner of impurities on contact. Therefore, his contact with death and subsequent resurrection encapsulates the salvation of the world, brought through the curse of death and into indestructible life. Okay, can I be honest? I'm actually quite nervous releasing this review, and I wasn't going to, because I know this is an extremely controversial subject among my Protestant friends, although weirdly it's not an issue for our Eastern Orthodox or Catholic brothers and sisters. So please be kind. If you want to start a fight, you can email me here. But if you want to have a compassionate conversation, I'd love to hear from you. I really would.